are only countries that are pure as the driven snow worth defending? I mean, there as you correctly point out, there are stages of development. There are countries at various stages of levels of corruption and whatnot. Um, at what point does that trigger? The implication seems to be at some point a country doesn't forgoes its right to defend itself because of its internal corruption, and that doesn't seem to follow
Yeah,
for most
exactly.
reasonable people.
Exactly. And so I think so this line of argumentation, and you typically see it in like YouTube comments and on X and like social media. So, and I've actually heard this in just general conversation though, too. So it's not like I'm picking up
Hmm.
on the dregs of the internet to see this. This has been a part of the conservative support for Donald Trump's peace diplomacy, and I think it's wrong. So I do think Mark Tooley was responding to that particular concern, and it's not an
Yeah.
irrelevant concern. That is a part of the debate, but that also happens to be where Mark and I are in total agreement. Ukraine has every right to defend itself. They are worthy of that defense, and they're worthy of our support in that defense. That is not to suggest that pursuing peace somehow means that we've discounted that, I think is silly.
And I think you would agree with this. And Thule, I think, is sensitive to that. You do hear folks and some on the right making kind of classic appeasement arguments, right?
Yeah.
And you did hear the Chamberlain side during leading up to World War II and after the invasion of Poland, even within the Churchill government. I'm forgetting the Lord's name, the politician's name, but he was saying, "Look, we can't fight this. We don't have a chance of success. We should sue Hitler for peace on the best terms we can get." And you do hear some people making those arguments, and Thule was sensitive to that and saying, "Look, we can't just give in to classic appeasement," and that's where I think you're right. He mentions Belgium in 1914, Britain in
Yep.
1940, Poland in 39, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, that makes sense. But your response is, but I'm not making that argument. There's within the
Yeah.
tradition that you don't have to go to the appeasement wing to make prudential judgments about how to employ force in these situations, right?
Right, and that's where we get to Wayne, the more particular piece of Tooley's critique that does come, is where he actually starts weighing the idea of like, well, does Ukraine have a probability of success? And I think this is where there's a more substantive debate between us, because it starts looking at like, hey, what are the variables that
Yeah.
determine probability of success? So he lists off several, such as the geographic size of Ukraine, the motivation of the population, the ability of Ukraine to sustain itself, not just with outside military aid, but its growing military industrial complex, the casualties of Russia, whether or not the Russian population is backing the war effort. And these are all variables worth considering. But I would argue, and he would say, and Tooley's point was, it was also a characterization of how should Ukraine respond to peace terms from Russia, and he was generally characterizing any peace agreement as being disadvantageous to Ukraine. And I think there was an implication there that any Trump brokered agreement is going to be disadvantageous to Ukraine, and this disadvantageous to Ukraine and advantageous to Russia. Which I think we also disagree on. So I'll address both those points. One, we don't really know what shape a ceasefire agreement will take. We're 2-3 weeks past that Oval Office meltdown, and we're still in the early stages of talking through the pieces of a ceasefire. We have a ceasefire framework that the Ukrainians agreed to with the Americans, but now the Russians want to speak into this, and all the while, both Ukraine and Russia are continuing to hammer each other with drones and missiles to make sure the other gets the message that they're not engaging in discussions because they're weak and ready to give in. So, I mean, we're still in the fog of war here. And 3 weeks ago, when we had this Oval Office meltdown, like that was in the very earliest stages of what a deal could look like. So I think there is an assumption among the kind of like Ukraine war observing class. There's an assumption that they know what a deal is going to look like, and that deal is just going to be disadvantageous to Ukraine, and therefore there's no need to proceed further. And I just think that's wrong on multiple levels. Not the least of which is we're not in all these meetings. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors. We're in the very earliest stages of this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think that that's something of a non sequitur to begin with. But then on the point of variables related to how do you assess probability of success, I think those are worth considering. You actually have to contemplate, hey, which of these variables is actually relevant here? One, but two, these variables that Mark listed in his article, they're variables for Ukraine to consider, such as the size of the country. They're either variables that are more relevant to Ukraine's decision to keep fighting, or variables that we just actually don't have any information on, such as, does the public support Vladimir Putin in Russia? We actually just have no idea. There's like no idea about what that looks like. So it's hard to assess that. And so should it even be part of that? Part of that discussion becomes, I think, a troublesome variable. So I really engaged in my response to Thule with that question of like, hey, which variables should we be considering when we are asking the question, is it prudent to continue the American policy of military support for Ukraine, and by military I just mean supporting their war effort, because this includes diplomatic, intelligence, and economic aid as well. Do we continue our current policy of supporting Ukraine in their war effort implicitly towards Ukraine's maximalist war aims, given facts on the ground? So the variables that Thule outlined were relevant for Ukraine making that determination for itself. But as a sponsor of Ukraine, we have a different set of variables we have to consider. And that's the argument I was trying to make is, we can't make, as much as we're supporting Ukraine in their war, it is still their war. And I think there's a certain blending of the war that's been unhelpful in the American discussion, where Ukraine's war has somehow become our war. And we need to be very, very careful of that, not the least of which is that poses a real risk to our relations and potential conflict escalation between us and Russia. So we have to be mindful of that. So given that context, we then have to think about, okay, what are the variables America needs to consider when it comes to continuing this policy of supporting the Ukrainian war effort? And I think one of the basic variables is Ukraine taking the policy steps necessary to achieve their war aims? And the answer there is not entirely. This is something that a lot of average Americans are unaware of. But the entire military age population of Ukraine has not been mobilized for this war. Rather, the Zelensky government has chosen to mobilize the older age cohorts while holding back the younger cohorts. And it's the argument has generally been a preservation of future generations and, preserve the young, put the old forward. Okay. And maybe they really do think that. Maybe that's actually the case. But there's been some really helpful analysis suggesting that, if that's the case, then this probably isn't as existential a conflict as Zelensky often portrays it. So that's
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, if you're not mobile, and wasn't aware of that. If you're not mobilizing the entire military age population, I mean that would be the logical thing to do if you felt an impending collapse of your society or a takeover.
right.
You like we're going to put everybody up there that we can.
Right.
I was not aware that there was this demarcation between the old and young.
Yeah, no, there really has been, and they're starting to move towards a broader generalization as some of their manpower
Okay.
shortages have started to bite. But part of the reason, then this partly explains why they haven't been able to make progress on the ground. They haven't been bringing as many men to the fight as they could. And all the number of like heavy arms and armaments and F-16s and tanks we can give them isn't going to change that. You need to put crews in those pieces. So that's one problem. The other problem is that's been noted is that in organizing new military units, there's essentially two ways you can fight a war. You can basically just recruit and train a bunch of people and then use them as replacements for casualties in units that already exist, or you can create brand new units. And
Right.
usually you get a hybrid of that. So relevant experience here for Americans and is World War II, where we had to massively mobilize our population to prepare for a war on two fronts. And you actually saw America do both. We stood up new units because we had a deep enough manpower pool. We stood up new units, new organizations. After World War II, we stood up a whole new branch of the military in the form of the Air Force. We totally did the new unit thing, but we also did the replacement thing. So a great example of this is for those of your listeners who are familiar with the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers and the Stephen Ambrose book that it's built on. There's a whole episode dedicated to, it's titled Replacements. And the statistic that got Ambrose's attention that led him to write the story of Easy Company was the fact that this was a company that suffered over 100% casualties in World War II. And that immediately gets someone's attention. It's like, wait, how does a unit continue to exist in suffering 100% casualties? Does that mean like all the original members die? Well, no, a lot of the original members lived. And like, how's that happen? Well, it's because they were getting replacements. It was because they were getting restocked and brought up to full manpower at different points as the war went on. So you can do both of these things. And there's arguments for and against both. If you put replacements in, it can more quickly ramp them up to combat experience because they're learning on the field with people who already have combat experience, but they also they do tend to have higher casualty rates because they're the new guys. If you stand up an entirely new unit, you do have the advantage of being able to train them on new weapon systems, which is why Ukraine has been standing up a lot of new units, because they're getting trained on a lot of new systems they're getting from America and European countries. And that was probably a big part of the thinking. But the problem is when you send the new units into combat, they obviously have a learning curve. They have a learning curve, and that learning curve can be very deadly depending on the situation. So what we've seen in Ukraine is a preference for standing up new units as opposed to filling existing combat experience units with replacements. This has reduced combat effectiveness. So on paper, they have a lot of new units in the field, but the combat effectiveness of those units has been diminished over time. So diminishing returns does set in. And so these are just like strategic planning errors that Ukraine has made. And they've made it as a function of our support for them. It's not that they've made it independent of our support. They've made those errors as a function of our support for them. They've stood up new units so that they can come train in America on American systems, which they take back into battle, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's one such instance. The other point to point out is we're in a stalemate with the amount of aid we've given them. So if we're going to break out of this stalemate, does that mean we need to give Ukraine more? The Trump administration has clearly drawn the conclusion of we're not going to do that. So either Europe has to step in, or we need to sue for peace. We need to figure something out.